2. We haven't had to do that much. We're going to do our sample with bias binding around the curved edge. So we've cut this from our pattern. There's my straight grain. And we're going to cut our own bias fabric strips. Don't use the prepackaged stuff. Now I want the binding to finish at 1/4 of an inch, that being the width that we'll see from the right side. So I've cut my strips at 1 1/4 inches wide. They're going to fold in like this and in like this and then in again. So this is different than the Hong Kong in that we are not going to have any raw edge showing. And so you would think 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, that's just 1 inch. Why did you cut it 1 1/4 inches wide? Well, it does narrow up a little bit. The folding consumes a tiny bit of the fabric, and then I've got a tiny bit of what I call insurance. And I have 2 strips here just to show you in case you need it. I can't imagine you would on this, but someday down the road you might, to join pieces of bias. We want to make the joining happen along a grain, so not on the bias edge. So here's one of my grain lines. We're going to go right sides together, and we don't want it to look like this when we put them together. That means we've got the wrong grain to the wrong grain. You want it to look quite awkward like this, and typically you only use 1/4 of an inch seam to join bias strips. So there's how your seam will look. If we tried to go just perpendicular to the cut edges of the bias, we'd stretch out that seam when we sewed it. And this way, especially if we are doing the binding where it's fold, 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 all of that seam allowance doesn't end up on top of itself, creating a lot of bulk. And I'm probably going to be able to avoid that seam altogether when I attach my binding. So, right sides together. A 1/4 of an inch seam. The bias, you'll find, will shape around the curve. A straight fabric or a straight ribbon will not. So that's why we use strips cut on the bias for this kind of thing. Okay. We don't need to do any clipping of this curve, but we do need to do some pressing. So let's go press. Let's see, if I get over here maybe, you'll have a better camera angle, won't you? Mm-hmm. Okay. Press it as it was sewn. Now I want to press the seam towards the binding. Then we're going to fold and fold over. So I just bring my cut edge to my other cut edges, and you can see that's a little more than 1/4 of an inch. But that's my insurance for my next stitch, so that it all gets caught. And now we want it to wrap snugly around the cut edge, because remember, we only want to see the 1/4 of an inch here. And perhaps a few pins will help hold it in place. Especially on my curved parts, I'm going to sort of double check that it is all at the 1/4 of an inch, because that's where it's going to want to kind of poof out some. But I think I'm good. I can compare, I can measure. You know, we want everybody to be uniform. And now we'll just edge stitch this down. I can be right on the edge of the binding, just against the seam, which is what we're going to do. You'd have options for actually coming back here and slip stitching it by hand so no stitch showed, but we're going to do an edge stitch on top of the binding.